I drive out here, my neighbors will attest. I do things differently than most. I guess it's just the way I am. A little bit about things I've got going on this year. I've got a oats and peas plot where I put oats and peas in ahead of corn, and I got it over on a different farm. But I had a combine there last year. I put a 25-wood cover crop blend afterwards. And then I had some hairy vetch that overwintered and a little bit of rye that come through the winter in the blend too. Not thick as I liked it. So I put oats and peas in a strip. And then I have that. And then I got a conventional hybrid there next to the triple stack corn, which I got a couple bags for a different trial I'm doing for that. And I wanted to see what the difference was in that. And that's something we looked at last night with Ryan. This spring in June, we were pretty dry, and the oats and peas used up about all available moisture. And so I do think that oats and peas this year in that blend is probably going to hurt me, but I am going to take that to harvest and see when we come with the combine. The last 2 years, I don't think it hurt me a bit. We had plenty of rain in June, and so I really like it. I'll do it again. But
and typically, though, you don't take anything to harvest. It's mostly earlage, correct?
Yeah, and basically earlage is will come in through here, and I'm probably going to do it Monday or Tuesday next week on this right here. We'll put a corn head on a chopper, and I make that into earlage for my fat cattle, and I run that all through. Most of what I do is ran through my livestock or my sheep, my live cattle or my sheep and stuff. I got a couple other places where after all my soybeans last year, I planted 20 pounds of hairy vetch, trina kale, and winter barley, 20 pounds of each, about 7 pounds of hairy vetch, and 10 pounds of winter peas. It was planted after soybeans, so it was October 10th or 15th, somewhere in there. And we got a nice stand on everything. And then all of a sudden it turned nasty cold and everything winter killed but the cereal rye. And that's part of the reason I don't like not putting cereal rye. Everybody's scared, or a lot of people are scared of putting cereal rye ahead of corn. I got a farm somewhere else I'd love to show you too, but we don't have enough hours in the day that Ryan and I picked a couple of ears off and showed Ryan last night. It was planted in cereal rye that was this high, late May, 20th or 25th of May, somewhere in there. And I think that corn's going to be between 150 and 200 on hill ground. It looks really good.
So you roll the rye down with a crimper type knife deal?
We planted it, we rolled it, and we sprayed it all within a day, 24 hours or 36 hours. I mean, that was in the order of how we did it.
You don't think the crimper roller would have done it just without spraying it?
No. We've tried it before, and Dad has a couple times. And to me, around here, we get enough sucker regrowth on that rye and stuff after you crimp it. We like the crimper in certain instances. We don't always use it. Depends on the circumstances. But when we use it, we still use a chemical application. We've tried not a couple times, and we had to add it. But anyway, so all of my bean ground that went to corn had that application. Then like across the ditch here, when we go up here, that was cereal rye last year. I planted my 25-wood cover crop mix in it. Ryan and I went out in October last year, right before the first freeze was predicted. We pulled a cover crop analysis off of it. And that's basically take a 3-foot square. We clip everything in it. We put it in a bag. We shipped it off to Regen Ag Lab up there. And they weighed it. It was 5.29 tons of dry matter off of that. That was after leaving all the rye residue. We didn't take anything off there except the rye. We didn't bale anything or anything on that. And we sent that off, and there was, my numbers ain't for sure about it, but it's like 80 some pounds. I can pull them up, but 80 some pounds of nitrogen that was available. And it'd be 40 pounds of phosphorus and 400 pounds of, no, I take that back. It was 160 pounds of nitrogen. 80 pounds were available this calendar year. 40 some pounds of phosphorus wasn't as high. But the potash was over 400 pounds was in that biomass. I grazed it with sheep and a few head of grass vats out there this last winter, and I planted corn into it. And so that's what that field is across the ditch. This field had soybeans in it last year, and then it had cereal rye before I planted the soybeans in that mix. But the only thing that was in here was cereal rye, and the year before it was corn. That was after that oats pea mix that we'd planted in the spring, planted early June. So I had corn in here a couple years ago with 80 pounds in. That made 150 bushel with 80 pounds of N. All of my corn this year has 120 pounds of N, and about 12 pounds of sulfur is the only fertility that's been added to this. Now, I do have cattle out here, and once in a while I will put manure on if I need to do something with manure. But This corn here has only had about 120 pounds of input on it this year, right here. And then we go across the ditch to the left. We park semis, combines, grain carts, whatever, right here. So when you go out in this field here, go 100 feet or 100 yards west to get out of where the high traffic area is. But start looking in there, and I got 25 different things, and a lot of people think I'm crazy with that. My thought process behind that is I want some warm season grasses. And so I've used Dale Strickler for a lot of years, and I've known him and stuff, and he's helped me with some of this, but I want some warm season grasses. So I'll use like Egyptian wheat. According to Dale and the research Regen Ag Lab's done, that Egyptian wheat's the most mycorrhizal friendly sorghum sedan or Sudex there is. And so I want some of that in there. It ain't all of that, but then I put like forage sorghum in there, sorghum or Sudex type thing in there. So I do multiples of that. Well, then I want some legumes in there. Well, cowpeas, mung beans, I want diversity in that. Well, if I put 4 or 5 of each thing and you got 4 different categories, pretty soon you got 20 things. Well, then I like gourds and pumpkins and things like that. You know, okra, buckwheat, you know, sunflowers, some other things. And so that's how I come up with my 25 different things. And it's a variety like Mother Nature has it in her prairies. It ain't near that extensive yet, but it's an annual variety, and that's what I like. And that's part of the reason I put such a diversity out there. And I have not figured my seeding costs this year. I tried to the other day, and I didn't get around to finishing it. Last year was like $58 an acre, so it isn't terribly expensive. I mean, you know, and I usually plant about 150 pounds of recommended seeding rate, or 150% of recommended seeding rate, because I have like a cool season. I have vetch in there, and I have spring peas, and I have some oats. And so I have some cool season, warm season things in there. So that's what usually the rate I shoot for. But
How many total pounds?
35, I think, or 40 of total
Of everything.
of everything. It ain't a great, I mean, there might be 10 pounds total of my sorghum sedans, or maybe it's only 7 or 8. I'd have to look. You know, it isn't super big amounts. It's 5 pounds of cowpeas, 5 pounds of mung beans, you know, 4 or 5 pounds of sun hemp, you know, 10 pounds of spring peas, you know, there is 10 pounds of oats, or maybe it's 5 pounds of spring peas, but 10 pounds of oats. But it's nothing huge of anything, but it's just diversity. And I did that because I graze on this farm, I graze sheep, but on a lot of my farms that I don't, or the farms that I don't, I graze cattle on in the fall. And this, I constantly got feed for the livestock. Well, I found out it's actually benefiting my soil. My organic matters are jumping. My infiltration rates, I believe, are doing very well. And my soil biology is really turning. I pulled 11 different Haney tests on different trials I had on my corn to find out how much nitrogen I should be applying. And I went out here, and depends on, because my corn got planted at different times because of the rains in May. The corn was anywhere from 6 inches high to about knee high, and I pulled this Haney test to see how much I should side dress. I put 50 pounds of nitrogen on with the planter. That's the first nitrogen I'd put on. And so I wanted to see how much to side dress. Well, it was calling for 120 pounds, or no, it was calling for another 80 pounds, but I'd already put some on, and so I added that 120 pounds I wanted to make it. But you can look at the corn here. I mean, you get the tougher spots, it shows more and whatever, but corn's pretty good, and Dale pointed out last night I didn't plant it thick enough. So when we were looking at the
organic matter now.
Depends on the farm.
Well, what does it range?
I've had some higher than 7, and I've had a lot of them are 3+. There was a lot of them in between. When I pulled my Haney test, looking for the nitrogen, they also do the respiration rate. And I learn something every day, or almost, but the respiration rate is part of what will help you determine if you should be planting corn, or you can plant corn into cereal rye, you know, green. If you got a high respiration rate, your soil biology is functioning. It'll help decompose everything faster. Talking with David Kleinschmidt out of Illinois, I asked him, I said, what's that range? Because he talks about that quite a bit. And he says, anything over 100. And I pulled 11 different tests, and they range from 150 to 500, my respiration rates. He goes, at 500, you have a hard time keeping soil residue, don't you? I said, yes. And that's part of the reason these are working so well is the first year you do it, it takes time, but livestock help. But if you can turn that, I had probably 2 tons of residue left on my cereal rye out in that field last year. And then I had 5.29 tons on there when we took that cover crop analysis. And we get out in that field, there's less than a ton, maybe less than a half a ton of residue left on the surface of the soil. And I graze sheep and stuff on it. But the sheep, you know, figuring out their animal needs, they graze just over 1 ton of residue off that. So that 7 tons, that was the soil turned themselves. So
Give a background on that farm that we're going to go check out here, what it was previously before you guys started cover cropping on it.
It was a CRP, brome CRP field that Dad bought, I don't know how many years ago, 10, 12. Okay, a while back. And it had quite a few cedar trees on it. And Dad waited until it got below 0 for a couple days, and he went out there with the dozer blade and popped them off about 6 inches below the ground, and he never did work it, except for filling in ditches like here.
So I might just add something on the planting corn into rye, because you hear some horror stories, and those horror stories do happen.
Yep.
I've heard people say, oh, I planted corn green into rye and it cost me 30 bushel or 50 bushel, and those stories do happen. And sometimes there's no effect at all, and sometimes there's even a yield increase. And University of Nebraska, this was back in the 80s, did a trial where they did continuous corn with, half the plots had rye in between the corn crops. And they had plenty of nitrogen, so nitrogen deficiency was not the issue. They fertilized in excess. The first 3 years, there was a 10 bushel decrease on the corn. The next 2 years was exactly even. The next 5 years, there was a 30 bushel bump on the plots with rye. You say, what's going on there? Well, you mentioned that when the biology starts... So Iowa State did some research onto what's causing that yield depression of corn after rye. And they found out it can be nitrogen, but that wasn't the entire... Even if you add plenty of nitrogen, sometimes you get this yield decrease. What they traced it back to was fusarium root rot that was transferring from the rye to the corn when you planted green. And you say, why does it disappear after you've done it so many years? Well, your biology gets active enough that fusarium organism just becomes part of the food chain. You build up the things that eat fusarium. You create a healthier soil. So as your respiration rate goes up, fusarium no longer becomes an issue. And so if you want to know, can I plant rye green or corn into green rye without issue, take your Haney test, find your respiration rate. If you're in that over 100, 150, you're probably going to be just fine.
Yeah.
The longer you're into this, the fewer of those issues you run into.
How soon before you want to plant the corn should you take the Haney test?
It doesn't matter. I mean, any time of year, winter before. You kind of want to be consistent when you take that from year to year, so that you can kind of establish, what your soil's doing. Another way around it is if you want the benefits of rye without the problems, say you're wanting to do it this year, you don't have that high respiration rate in your soil, you can kill the rye 2 weeks ahead of planting corn. That kind of allows the fusarium organism to starve out. And I've had some people in the past plant a mixture of rye and vetch, and they used clethodim to selectively take out the rye 3 weeks or so ahead of corn planting. And then they planted green into the vetch, which is a legume. They wanted the vetch to grow longer, and then they took it out at planting with a broadleaf herbicide, like a dicamba or something like that.
And I encourage you, when you do some of this stuff, try it in trials. I mean, I got trials, some of them are just visual. I mean, some of them ain't always with the combine, but try them in trials. I mean, I hate for somebody to go home and try something. Well, Bill said to do this, and you have a failure, and you miss that farm payment or whatever. I don't want everybody to I do a lot of trials. I don't talk about a lot of them or whatever, and I'm always free to talk about them, but do trials on your own farm, because everybody, even if you try and replicate exactly what I'm doing or what somebody else is doing, you're not going to do it the same. There's always something different out there. So do your own trials and your own learning.
What about slugs?
Slugs, roly-polies, snails. slugs and snails are mollusks. Roly-polies are crustaceans. And the reason, we never used to hear of these problems 30 years ago. No one ever had a field of soybeans eaten by roly-polies. Why are we having problems with these things now? Now, some of it is because we're leaving more residue, so we have more habitat for them. But more importantly, what's happening is neonicotinoid insecticides, Poncho, Cruiser, Gaucho, those are taken up by the plant and make the plant toxic to insects that eat them. And when they came out, I thought, oh, these chemicals are wonderful. This is so much better than Counter and Furidan and all the stuff we used to use that just, high mammalian toxicity and stuff. I was like, God, this stuff is so great. It doesn't hurt people, doesn't hurt wildlife. It only makes the plant toxic, and it's only going to kill the things that eat the plants. Well, it made the insects that ate on it toxic, and then the things that eat those insects were poisoned. So neonicotinoid insecticides just wipe out spiders and ground beetles that eat slugs and snails and roly-polies. And our fields are just free of those predators now. So we really need to move away from those neonicotinoids as a routine practice. They've had some real unintended consequences. And some of them we're just beginning to understand.
How about their effect on bees?
Yep. Well, I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, they're finding very high levels of neonicotinoids in honey. Not so much on corn, because honeybees really don't visit corn, but they do visit soybeans quite a little bit. And neonicotinoids have never really had a great benefit on soybeans. We just kind of put them on there just because. On corn, they're pretty good for taking out cutworms, flea beetles, which spread Stewart's wilt. I mean, I don't know when the last time I saw a field of Stewart's wilt. But so neonicotinoids cured some problems, but created other problems. So there's a lot of unintended consequences there. And really the only way of getting back is to reestablish those predators.
Okay, Dale, you were talking about corn. We're down here where it's dry. How can we put sorghum grain into this instead of corn? Has anybody tried that?
Oh yeah. Actually works a little better because because sorghum's usually planted later. It can go, a month later than corn with similar yield results. You can allow that winter cover crop to grow that much longer and produce that much more benefit for you. Particularly if that winter cover crop's hairy vetch or winter peas or some legume. And I've seen where people have no-till planted sorghum into a sweet clover crop or a hairy vetch or a winter pea. No added nitrogen, broke 100 bushel. Yeah. That's a pretty cheap crop.
And the thing about milo, I'm not doing it anymore because I planted all my ground back to a mix of grasses and 7 legumes. But the thing I really miss about the milo is I planted food grade white milo, and it doesn't have the tannins in it that the red milo's got. And those cattle just absolutely love those leaves and stalks of that food grade white milo. So if you're a grazer and got livestock, I'd look into the food grade white milo because it is really a benefit compared to the red milo in my experience. And another thing, if you were growing food grade white milo, I met a lady the other day at the governor's conference, and they built a flour mill in Kansas that buys food grade white milo, and they're making flour out of it because the grain in that doesn't have the gluten that wheat does. And so they're really interested in buying food grade white milo from farmers, and they don't want to buy it from the elevators because it's getting contaminated by other things and bugs. And so they're buying it directly from the farmer instead of it elevate.
Where's that mill located?
I don't remember.
Outside Salina, isn't it?
I thought it
Solomon?
was down Stockton. Or, I don't remember. I could get it for you.
I think it's Solomon.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, so, but the food grade white Milo, if you're a livestock producer and graze your stocks, is a real plus versus the red Milo because it's the tannins that make it bitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
I only know enough to be dangerous, but that's an experience.
And as we go by here, I was helping the cousins chop the other day and the appraiser's out and they were doing corn yields and whatever. And they take 17.5 feet, which guys know is 1,000th of an acre or whatever that is. And they're weighing a 5-gallon bucket on corn. And the ratio on that is real close to for every pound in the bucket, it's 10 bushel corn yield at about the dough stage or whatever. And so we're going to do that going by here just to kind of show you guys what can be done on 120 pounds of N on here. And this was planted May 3rd, I believe. I just looked. So
One thing,
Sure.
your planting rate on the field.
27,000. And Dale informed me last night I messed up. And I'll let him explain why.
Okay, so the rule on corn population is that you keep pushing it until you start seeing tip back. Once you start seeing a little bit of tip back, you kind of hit your maximum population. And you can see this is filled clear to the end. So the conditions here could have supported
They are. I don't know if it makes any
more plants.
How many?
So he's not maximizing his yield. His population's not maximizing his yield for what he has here.
I think that's all.
3,000 plants.
Yeah, he planted 27. I'd probably pump it up to like 32. Okay, now one change that has happened with corn genetics is that breeders have been breeding corn to plant a higher population. Of course they would. You sell more seed that way. Okay, but it's legitimate. Those recommendations, the optimum population for corn has gone up and up over the years. Because back in the 70s, almost every corn hybrid was actually the same corn hybrid in different bags. But those leaves were very, very horizontal. And so each individual plant took up a lot of space. Now you look at these corn leaves now, they're very vertical. They're designed for higher populations. And the reason is, if you have an acre of leaves like this, you have 1 acre of leaves on an acre. But if you can tilt those leaves up like this, you know, you've got a diagonal here that's intercepting that light. Just like you can fit more plants in a crooked row, you know, you have this corrugated canopy that spreads the sunlight over about 1.5 acres of leaves on an acre of soil. So that's why corn hybrids now with this very erect leaf structure have more yield potential. But to realize that potential, you need more plants.
What's it going to
Grain.
It's 25.
Oh,
So
yeah,
how's that
25.
work?
Yeah.
25 pounds for non-GMO corn with 120 pounds, or yeah, so it'd be 250 bushel with the appraisal would do that roughly. It puts a little bit of formula in, but that's pretty dang close. The appraisal. Now you combine it, sometimes it's 10-20% off of that, but 250 bushel corn with 120 bushel or 120 pounds of nitrogen applied.
Serious cost savings on that.
Pretty happy with that.
Yes. So this is part of the reason I do some of the things I do. I mean, it don't necessarily look a lot better than the neighbors or whatever, but I try and save costs and things like that. But I thought about doing this last night just to see where it come out because I really didn't know. But
Glad we did it.
but that gives you a ballpark. I know guys do kernel counts and whatever, but talking with some guys that do some irrigation and things like that, they said the kernel size varies so much and whatever. They said this is the most accurate way. It still ain't perfect, but it's the most accurate way to determine how your fields are going to be.
What do you think would have happened if you had a higher seeding rate?
Probably would have been higher.
300?
I don't know. We don't have a variable rate planter. You know, if you had a variable rate planter in here, like here we got a nice bottom, you got these hillsides. The hillsides 27's plenty on them.
Yeah.
You know, in the bottom, you know, it should have been 32 or something. So if we had a variable rate planter, you could play with some of those things and gain it. But for the cost of one and no more corn than 200 acres or whatever corn I put in a year, it's kind of hard to pay for a variable rate planter on the expensive one. So
What kind of herbicide program do you run, like on your corn?
This field was corn straight through here, and it's weedy now. I didn't shred it until we combined the rye. But this spring I put on atrazine, dual, and dicamba, and Roundup as my burn down and my residual. And then at post spraying, I put on impact and atrazine. That was my post spray. Pretty simple, cheap herbicide program. But I use my rotations to help with that, except when you open it up like this, you do get some weeds. We started farming a different farm here the last year or two that's been handled different than my farms, and that chemical program has been working, but not as well. And this is non-GMO corn, so I can't spray Roundup or anything like that, you know, post. I would probably plant some Roundup corn early on those other early adapting farms, you know, but with my rotations with the others, I feel I have adequate weed control for what I need. It ain't perfect by any means, but my sheep love eating the weeds, so. And what's fun, I mean, and looking at this, you know, it's yay high, and Brian come out about 2 weeks ago, and it was
knee high.
Between knee and crotch high. And part of the reason the field days later this year is you see this, but it's August 31st. When we come out here in September 31st, it's going to be up into here, you know, and part of the reason with the cover crops, and I like these as cereals, is I get some growth on these. I got a field north of my house up there where the sheep are at now. We can't get to it very easy. I would have loved to take you guys out there. It was planted June 17th, and I got some pictures on my phone. And that's what's laying outside the door when you walk in. I pulled the sample there, but it's huge. And it's just unreal. Or I combined my pick and feed over there, I call it my pig and chicken feed, oats and peas, and that was planted July. Well, my son did it when I was on vacation, so I don't know the exact date, and I haven't asked him, but we was gone, so it was planted about the 25th or so of July, and that's knee high after oats and peas. But, you know, so everything's different. Now, I'll do this on fields. I took some oats and peas chopped this spring on fields I've never planted cover crops on before. I started renting. The guy I've been using cereal rye some, but nothing else. I did that in June, and it's taller than this, but it was dry in June. About 20% came up, and then their other 20 or 80% sat there for 2 weeks until it rained. The problem was the pigweeds and things like that, and if you drove that way, you drove by it. The pigweeds come up too early on, so I like hitting this stubble with Roundup, which I don't like Roundup, but it's something quick. I don't have to wait to plant. It cleans most everything out. I'll plant this, and if I can get it up right away, I don't have much weed issue. Where I run into troubles is it was dry, everything didn't want to come up right away, but the cattle are going to be out there shortly, and they're going to eat the pigweeds with everything else. And so,
What'd you have in this previous?
cereal rye combined in July.
What did it make?
30. Nothing special.
Yeah.
But I put a and I can't think of the name of it. A cheap herbicide on my rye this spring to clean the weeds out of it, and Roundup. Those are the two chemicals I used this year on this field. Well, last year I used the same as right over there. You know, so that's my chemical program for 2 years. You know, so I got chemical out here and I use chemicals, but I try not to use any more than I have to.
You apparently had some good rain because this soil is moist up on top of you.
Raleigh, what do we had in the month of August for rains? Do you know?
We're gonna have, what, 2 inches?
That's why I was thinking 2 inches, a little bit less right here for the whole month of August.
When did that come?
80 hundredths or an inch come this last weekend.
Yeah.
But we had,
We had like an inch.
yeah, on the 4th we had an inch. But and we had that hot dry spell, you know, and cattle were dying and everything else in the lots and whatever. So, but you know, I like spring peas in the mix. Here's one.
Yeah.
So yeah, Bill, go ahead and I guess give a breakdown of roughly what all you've got in here, and then let's do a little ID and reasoning with Dale.
Okay, so on the grass side of it, I planted oats. If I remember right, 5 or 10 pounds, somewhere in there. I'd have to look. Egyptian wheat, a sorghum sedan, a forage sorghum, and millet.
Yeah.
That's probably the bigger ones.
Yeah. Okay, so the Egyptian wheat.
I did have some Japanese millet left over in the drill from the previous field. Yeah, I think right here's the Japanese millet.
Yeah. So the Egyptian wheat, you'll see the taller sorghum here. Egyptian wheat is not actually wheat. It is a sorghum. It's got the white midrib and the narrow leaves. And it, like Bill said earlier, when we have sampled the root ball and done a Haney test on the root ball, Egyptian wheat was just head and shoulders above everything else. The stuff gets just insanely huge. It's not a real good forage. Among sorghums, it's one of the worst forages, but it's probably the best soil builder, probably the toughest sorghum that I've seen as far as drought and handling sand or real heavy clay or, you know, some sort of. It's also the one that if I'm going to drill something into brome for the summer, this is my number one choice. I have more success with Egyptian wheat into brome than anything else.
So what's the deal about the quality not good as the other sedan buses? What does it not have that the other has?
I'll show you. So here's the other one.
We got one.
Look how tiny this one is and the nodulation already on it.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at the leaf width.
Oh.
The leaf stem ratio is, I mean, the Egyptian wheat puts on a lot of stalk compared to the leaves. The leaves are really narrow, and it's not a brown midrib, so it's not as digestible. For those of you not familiar with brown midrib, the indigestible component of plants, as far as a ruminant animal is concerned, is lignin. And brown midribs are genetically unable, they're naturally occurring mutation. They're not genetically able to produce lignin. So that makes the entire plant far more digestible than a standard sorghum or anything other. That's why a brown midrib, if I want to produce animal gains this time of year, I want a plant with a brown midrib. It's found in sorghum. Corn has some mutations that are brown midrib, and pearl millet has some mutations. Those are the three plants. All of them warm season grasses, so they grow really fast this time of year. That's going to give you your best animal gains, as long as it's in a mix with some other things. You can do a pure stand if you want to, but you'll get far better animal gains if those animals have diversity.
Yeah.
If you're going overfeed that with a legume, what would
Thank you for asking. So. Okay, so a couple legumes I've spotted in here. 3 of them actually.
There's 4 at least.
Yep. Okay. Okay, there's a better one.
We got vetch and peas yet also.
Okay, so here's sun hemp. These are the 3 summer annual warm season legumes. We've got sun hemp, and sun hemp has a fairly hard woody stalk, so it can cause some issues when it gets, especially for beginning cover croppers. This is a nitrogen producer like no other though. And these leaves are about 30% protein. Now it is high in alkaloids. It's animals will only eat so much of this before they just voluntarily quit. But this stalk, very fibrous, very woody. It's called sun hemp, not because it has medicinal value, but because it is used as a rope crop. So it has real strong fibers in the stem, actually much stronger than marijuana hemp. For some reason, though, there isn't the enthusiastic promotion of this plant like there is of marijuana hemp. It's almost like that marijuana hemp has another use that they're not telling us about. But this has been used for construction as well. Okay. These, you'll notice there's these two big trifoliate leaf plants. One of them is kind of hairy and dull colored. That's mung bean. The one with the very shiny, smooth leaves is cowpeas. Mung bean's really cheap. It's got small seeds, so you can plant that really easy. One of the benefits of cowpeas is that they will vine and climb up the stems and reach sunlight. So a mixture of cowpeas will find all the gaps in the canopy and shade the ground, convert that sunlight into protein and nitrogen. A couple cool season legumes. Now, ordinarily, when you plant, if you were to plant hairy vetch like this, you'll see it's all viney. A few of them in here have little purple flowers on them. If you were to plant hairy vetch in July in a typical hot, dry summer, it would probably just die. The spring peas will do a little better, but they'd really struggle. But when you, and I mean, you can squat down in here. I mean, it's not a hot day, but you can tell how much cooler it is at knee level than it is at shoulder level in here. When you have these plants transpiring, you get evaporative cooling. You create a cooler microclimate that allows these cool season plants to thrive. And the benefit of having these in here, these other legumes, I mean, the legumes are in here for protein and nitrogen, also calcium in an animal's diet. But once frost hits, if you want to graze this in the summertime, these are great. If you want to graze this in the wintertime, first frost hits, these leaves are gone. These cool season legumes will still be in here nice and green. And this canopy that's cooling this in the summertime will retain the ground's heat in the wintertime, and these will stay much longer, green much longer into the winter than they would without this canopy over it. It is absolutely amazing when I've seen plots where they have single species of these things that, you know, this might actually winter kill in mid-November if it's out by itself. You have a mix like this, it might stay green 2 months longer until it gets down well below zero. So it's pretty amazing.
And one thing we haven't talked about in here is this is a 3D canopy. Instead of having everything at one plane, so you get more depth to your sunlight.
You get the
more
corrugated leaves.
Yep.
More than an acre of leaves on an acre of ground.
Yep.
And my guys that are obsessed with nitrogen, if you can find a tiny little hairy vetch plant right now, grab a spade, dig it up real quick, and check out the nodulation that's already happening on that.
Will it go to seed if you leave it long enough? Yeah. It's a pretty long-winded plant, but
Will it be viable next year?
it can be, yes. Yeah, it can volunteer.
And that's the legume side of it. And then I got 5, and I found 4 of the 5. Those might be the same one.
Brassicas.
Yeah, brassicas. I got nitro radish, forage collards, turnip, purple top turnip, so I didn't find one of them yet. Maybe right there. And then, but anyway, there's 5 different brassicas in here. And I like them because each one has a different root structure. And above ground is different. Animals like some of them better than others. I don't want animals eating everything in this mix. I want some of it left out here for the cover and the ground. One thing that I noticed a couple years ago, and I don't remember if I've ever told Dale this or not, but in December of 21, we had that 100-mile-an-hour wind for half a day or a day, just blew and blew and blew. I had some of my cover crop mix standing out there like this. I grazed a lot of it, but some of it was still real tall. It was all frosted. I went out there, everything was laying flat, except for one plant. Does anybody have a guess on which one plant was still erect and still standing this high? Sun hemp. Yep, it withstood it. Everything else fell down around it. So if you're going to plant a straight stand of sun hemp, just remember it can, I've known guys that have issues planting with it. I know guys that do it or work with it, but just remember, straight sun hemp can cause problems planting the next spring. It can be managed, but just remember that. But it worked great. And I bring sheep out here, and if I don't get a real strong wind event, and I'll start grazing this side and strip it up the hill, I'll use this as my windbreak for the sheep in the wintertime. You don't see much for trees here. I got trees over the hill, but it works as a windbreak for my livestock to lay down on the south side of this, you know, on cold, snowy days and when it's below zero, and it works great.
Having the sunflowers, the sun hemp, and the okra, which is this, also you get some structure to hold the sorghums up in the wintertime so it doesn't just all mat down on the ground after frost. You can hold it up erect, up in the air, so it doesn't rot, and it's more available for winter grazing. The okra is a member of the same family as cotton. It's got some beneficial compounds in its leaves that reduce intestinal worms, intestinal parasites. Very high in protein. Gives you some different plant diversity. It's got a monster taproot on it. I mean, I've seen taproots like this, some of the nastiest clay in Oklahoma. Sunflowers. Sunflowers have just a wonderful root system. They're not quite as taprooted as what people think. They're more of a massive root, but they really do a good job of loosening soil. They attract a big host of beneficial insects. As far as livestock grazing, the heads are super nutritious because they're full of oil. That oil, one of the advantages of having oil this time of year is that oil goes right through the rumen without fermenting. So, because rumen fermentation causes heat. And so starches, sugars, fiber all create heat in that animal. Oil does not. So they can get an energy boost with that oil without adding heat load to them, which is really important this time of year. Also, sunflowers are very, very high in zinc. If you look at a bag of cattle mineral, the things that you get in that cattle mineral, usually, most important things, other than salt, are phosphorus, copper, and zinc. And so this is one of the plants that's particularly high in zinc. It's got about 16 times the zinc content of corn, for example. So zinc is particularly important for breeding bulls. So if you're shifting your calving season to be more in sync with nature and your forage supply, and you want to promote breeding this time of year, sunflower is a good thing to have in the mix.
You don't see it right here where the stand is thicker, but if you get thinner spots or like we walk through, you'll see I got pumpkins, I got melon mix from green cover seed, pumpkins, squash, and then I also throw in a little bit of their milpa mix. And when Ryan first started visiting my farm, he was arguing with me, fun discussion, and why can't you just plant 2 or 3 things? And I said, because I don't know what's going to grow. Or what I plant right here is going to look different than what I plant on the side of that hill. That's gumbo. Or on top of the terrace or terrace channel. I throw this mix out here, and this mix looks different here than if you go up halfway up the hill. Your brassicas and things like that on your thinner dirt, when the Sudan and stuff ain't thriving so well, they actually do better up there. And so this is a great place for me. Just it's a one-pass deal. I kit everything, and different things will express themselves differently throughout the whole farm.
Yeah.
But these fill in tremendously on spots where you don't have anything else where it would probably be weeds. You may still get a few weeds, but these fill in and vine in there and fill those voids greatly.
Yeah. If you have a skip, you'll end up with a whole bunch of fruit in there And the fruit is, it's a lot of fun to watch cattle eat pumpkins.
Yeah.
I had a neighbor that was a big pumpkin producer where I used to farm, and the day after Halloween, it was free for all. You could just load up all the trailers you wanted because he couldn't sell them after Halloween. So I'd go out there, load up trailers, take them to my cows. The first time I did that, they looked at me, what is this? And I had a bull that had been exposed to pumpkins before, and he knew what to do. So he walked over there, stomped on one, took a bite, then walked to the next one, took a bite, and I walked over there, and I hadn't given the cattle salt for a couple days intentionally. I took a handful of salt, put it on that pumpkin, and then the cows went after the salt, say, wow, this stuff is good. And then from that point on, those cows lined up like that guy was Elvis or Justin Bieber or one of those guys. Just, he turned into God to those cows. He was just rock star. But pumpkins are insanely nutritious. You fattened your...
Grass-fat cattle do very well. Dale tells me that it's almost the right amount of protein and energy for a fat cattle ration. So if you're trying to fatten something naturally or whatever, it works very well for that. I mean, I use it even on buying cattle at the sale barn just to grow before I put them in a cattle shed and finish them with corn. This mix out here, I start cattle on, and they do very well on, and my death loss has really dropped. It's definitely been a benefit for me putting cattle out here early. 3 days after I buy them in a sale barn, they're out on a cover crop mix like this.
Yeah.
And health is so much better on those animals.
Yeah. The seeds have a deworming compound in them. It's about 70% as effective as Ivomec in Eastern European research. Some Serbian veterinarians told me about that, and looked up the research, and they are correct. Pretty effective. Another thing about it, gourds. If you want a concentrated energy source deep into the winter, gourds are great. And gourds are different than the pumpkins and the melons because, like the cowpeas, when the stand gets thick, they will climb up in the canopy and find sunlight. And gourds, pumpkins, when they freeze down, they'll kind of turn to mush and rot. Okay. Gourds stay good the entire winter long. I've picked gourds that were still edible the following June. Okay, buckwheat. Buckwheat's a really interesting plant. It has secretions out of the roots that make phosphorus more available. So it increases the availability of phosphorus within your soil. And the flowers, it's not much of a grazing plant by itself, but the flowers have pollen that are almost the perfect balance of amino acids for ladybug larvae and lacewing larvae. So sorghums can be absolutely devastated by sugarcane aphids, a whole bunch of aphids, green bugs, cornleaf aphids. There's all kinds of aphids that attack sorghums. And the aphids usually move in late in the season, just fly in and just overwhelm the plants. But you'll get ladybugs, but they'll come too little too late. If you have buckwheat in your mix, though, the ladybug and lacewing adults will preferentially lay eggs on this buckwheat, and the larvae can feed on that pollen, and you can raise up several generations of ladybugs on this feed source, so that when the aphids arrive, there are millions of ladybugs and lacewings already in the field there to eat them. I've never heard of anyone ever having to spray for sugarcane aphids when they had buckwheat in the mix. And sometimes that's when the milo field right next to it is completely devastated, got sprayed twice, and still devastated. Yeah. It's just using biology. If you understand the system, and I'm going to hit a lot on understanding how things, don't just do practices, understand how things work. Looks like you've got something to show.
I was going to ask you too, Dale. Be critical. What would you do, or what should I add to change this or to improve this?
Nothing. Yeah.
So, Bill, when would you put your cows out here?
Depending on need of feed. And that's part of the reason I have the Sudex and the Sedan. The Sedan holds its, or the forage sorghum holds its feed value longer into the winter. Correct, Dale?
Yes.
And so I have them both. I got a tremendous feed over there for my sheep. This is where my sheep go, and then I'll bring some other animals to kind of fill in the void. My sheep usually go out here in September or October, depending on when I run out of feed where the sheep are at. That's kind of with the other field. September, October, sometimes it's November or December, just depending on each field. You know, if I got a corn field and I don't have fence between the corn and that, and I don't want to polywire it, I'll wait until after the corn's harvested and then put it in. So it kind of depends, but any time from basically now on.
If anyone wants to see that, we should definitely take a trip up there. And the reason why I say it is Bill took me there 2 weeks ago now. He's got 200 head of sheep out on 10 acres right now, and I haven't seen a single one. I can hear them, but I can't see them. So.
Well, you can today because they need moved again. But
okay, so
I do a poor man's job of script grazing. So I might in the fall I'm harvesting, and I'm buying a lot of cattle out of the barns and stuff, and so I'm not doing this a lot. So I might set it up for a week or two. You know, I might go up to the top terrace up here and shoot it straight across, and let them in here for a week or two, and then maybe cut it in half once. And then when they get it gone, I'll let them come back to this and have my water source here. I got a water line over here in the waterway, and I'll let them come back, and then I'll go up the hill. And so I may graze it 4 or 5 times. And then once everything freezes, a lot of times I just pull the fence and let them have the whole thing, and I'm lazy. I try not to, I get more good out of it by strip grazing it, but on the same token, you got to figure in your time, and what works for each person individually varies. And so what do you want to do?
you mean talk about?
Whatever you want.
Oh, okay. Just might mention this Japanese millet here. This is another grass, and you asked if I would do something different. Depending on your goals, I like having an additional understory grass, something that's shorter, kind of spreads. Honest to God, my favorite one for grazing is crabgrass. Crabgrass is absolutely amazing as a grazing plant because, you know, if you are summer grazing this, every time you go through here, you're going to lose plants. Crabgrass spreads and will establish roots from the stems when it hits the ground. So crabgrass actually thickens up as the season progresses, and it reseeds itself. And that's the best thing about crabgrass if you want to graze that every winter or every summer. The worst thing about crabgrass is it reseeds itself. So it can be a weed if you want to grow grain crops. But if you're dedicated to grazing, and crabgrass is very, very tolerant of shade, which is very unusual of a warm season grass. Most warm season grass is highly shade intolerant. Crabgrass can handle a lot. This Japanese millet, its claim to fame is it will grow in standing water. If you've got wet spots, terrace channels, drown out spots, Japanese millet is the best thing there. You mentioned sorghum Sedan versus forage sorghum. When do you use each? If you want summer grazing, I'd focus on sorghum Sedan because it'll regrow so much better. After frost, though, forage sorghums are much superior. They'll have a higher sugar content in the stalk, so the stalks are more palatable. And the leaf attachment on the sorghum Sedan, the leaf attachment here at the base is really narrow. A forage sorghum will wrap around, so the leaves stay attached much, much better on a forage sorghum than it will a sorghum Sedan. Sorghum Sedans, usually once frost hits, they kind of shred and the leaves just end up on the ground. So for winter grazing, forage sorghum. For summer grazing, sorghum Sedan. And it doesn't hurt to have some diversity out there either. So.
Show them that root system.
Oh yeah, this is For no older than these plants are, this is pretty good. You build soil organic matter with with microbes, and microbes feed off root exudates. Sorghum Sudan, I saw a study, it was done way back in the 60s, but they measured the root exudates on sorghum Sudan versus corn. Sorghum Sudan had 16 times more root exudates than corn. So that's why sorghum Sudan is, if you want to build organic matter really, really fast, like in one season, sorghum Sudan's it. Forage sorghum is right up there.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
We're trying to talk to people about managing their cover crops with livestock, not the other way around. So he's doing it on a feed basis. What about people who want to do it as a management practice, not necessarily a feed basis?
You mean just without livestock in the system?
No, in the livestock in the system, but to manage it, to improve their soil health, accelerate their soil health, all those kind of things.
Okay. So I said the primary driver of soil health is microbes that feed on root exudates. So root exudates are the big driver. So that's why having a warm season grass is important, because they tend to have higher levels of root exudates. Having diversity is critically important because the legumes provide protein if you feed soil microbes the same way you feed cattle, and for the same reason, because the soil is a big microbial fermentation vat. Cattle, rumens, are a big walking fermentation vat. They eat similarly. If you know how to feed livestock, you know how to feed soil. They need carbohydrates, they need fiber, they need protein, they need minerals, they need fats. So do soil microbes. So I told you that this sorghum Sudan is great at producing sugar. It's a warm season grass. Warm season grasses produce a lot of sugar per acre. But you get these legumes in here, they produce a lot of protein, also calcium. What you see above ground is usually indicative of what you get below ground. The sunflowers, zinc, copper, and oil. And so you get all this diversity. The cucurbits, like the gourds and the pumpkins, they provide other things. You get that diversity. It's just like cooking when you're preparing a meal for yourself. Does anybody want to eat corn every day of your life and nothing but ground corn? No. You throw in something for protein. You throw in something for some flavor. Like you might put some oregano in there. Well, oregano has essential oils. It does some of the same things that sunflower does. You start adding all these things together, you just create a more nutritious meal for microbes. It's really simple. Feed your soil microbes like you feed your livestock. And so what's best for the livestock is actually best for the soil. And so adding livestock to the system is better than just letting this grow and fall over. Now, why is that? Well, again, it goes back to microbes, because below ground is a great habitat for microbes. Above ground is not, because you've got ultraviolet light. You can go to Cabela's and get a little ultraviolet light thing that you stick in water that sterilizes the microbe, kills the microbes in water, so it's safe to drink. Well, what's 16 hours a day of sunlight? It's sterilizing this environment. And microbes need protection from ultraviolet light. They need stable temperature that has to be warm. They need it consistently moist. How consistently moist is this canopy here?
Pretty good for 2 inches of rain in the month of August.
Yeah, but compare it to below the soil.
Right.
Say, if only I had a machine that could come in here, take this high sugar stuff and this high protein stuff, and it'd be self-propelled, completely solar powered. It'd grind all this stuff up, put it into a fermentation chamber, and ferment it for 48 hours and then deposit it out on this soil surface, I could turn all this stuff into soil instead of just letting it rot on the surface and take years and not happen very efficiently. That's exactly what happens inside a rumen. It is the perfect way to convert this top material into manure, which is your best soil builder outside of those root exudates. So you can make top growth build soil a lot like root growth builds soil by running it through a ruminant. But you don't want to run 100% of it through a rumen. You want to take the leaves but leave the stems.
Yep.
Because if you make the soil bare, has anybody ever seen how they make adobe? They take soil, they moisten it, they mix straw and residue in there and let it bake in the sun. Why do they let it bake in the sun? You get it to 120 degrees, kills the microbes. And that's how you get a brick. We do not want the sun to ever bake our soil. You kill the microbes just through solar heat, you turn it into a brick. We don't want that. So you have to leave, always have cover over that soil to prevent the adobe process from taking place.
When I graze this, typically it's about 30 or 33% utilization. So I ain't, if I was a pure livestock guy, I might be 60% utilization, or if you hate it, you're going to take most of it. I used to think I was taking more just by before and after pictures, but after Ryan and I pulled cover crop analysis, and using the animals eat 3% of their body weight a day, using those calculations on the number of animals I had in the field and the weights, I'm only using about 30 or 33% of it looks like more, but most of your weights in your stems and things like that. So, and I am usually leaving the stalks and the ground, what the cattle tromp on stuff, or the sheep and whatever won't eat everything they defecate on or whatever. So
Jay Fuhrer up in North Dakota, the guy who taught Gabe Brown, he showed me an analysis he did that I thought was just, because the temptation is, back up a little bit, the temptation is when you're a livestock guy, you see this as feed alone, and I'm going to be efficient, so I'm going to eat 100% of this. And those of you who have rented the grazing rights out to your cover crops have probably seen this happen, because they think that their route to making more money is to eat more of this. So Jay Fuhrer went in and took these cover crops and he balanced them on his finger. He'd tie them in a bundle, balance them on his finger without he'd cut them at ground level. He'd balance them on his finger until he got to halfway. Right there. This went in the bag, this went in the bag. And then he did a feed analysis. And I entered the numbers from the feed analysis into a calculation I learned in college to predict average daily gain. This top half of the plants, the composite said animals, an 800-pound steer would gain 3.05 pounds a day. Guess what it was on the bottom half?
less than 1.
0.05. Nothing more than maintenance feed. You cannot afford to allow animals, even as a livestock guy, if they are eating nothing but these stems, they are probably losing weight. You can't afford to let them eat this stuff.
Yep.
This is for soil. This is your soil armor. And when you allow animals to eat your soil armor, it doesn't do the animals any good, doesn't do your soil any good. So if you're the livestock guy and the soil guy,
yep.
then it's double stupid.
Hey,
that's why he doesn't do it.
Well, I say that, and I don't see Roy here because he's always good about making fun of me. But and him and I do have fun with each other. but a couple years ago, or 5 years ago, not Roy Winkler, Roy Buessing.
Oh,
Anyway, I planted a cover crop mix like this, and I had a few grass fats, and I was grazing. It's a triangular shaped field right next to the tracks, and so I started at the wide end, worked to the narrow end. Had like a month of grazing there with 5 head. Wasn't very big, or 7 head, wasn't very many. I got down to the end, I set my corral up there. It wasn't supposed to rain. I'd bring them in that last paddle like this. The corral was set up around it. They'd go in and graze, I'd haul them off. Well, it rained an inch that night, and the next night it rained 2. 6 days before I could get to that field to get them cattle off there. And they had grazed everything like I was trying to do there with Dale. They grazed everything. Well, what happens? When cattle get hungry, what do? They walk. And they turned this into a black field that looked like you took your fist out there. My cousin took a nice picture of it after I finally got them off and says, what kind of tillage pass was this out here anyway? It looked bad. It looked bad. And so using things I'd learned prior and trusting the system, I drilled cereal rye into it. This was probably late September. I drilled cereal rye into it that fall after it dried up. And then the other side of the tracks, I was just continuously grazing more, and so cattle didn't pug it up like that and have an issue. But we put corn in there the next spring, and we really couldn't tell anything. I never did work it. Those tracks are gone. I can take you to that field and you would never know it. I was scared to death when it happened, but this is what I learned to do. I went ahead, I trusted the system. I put rye in there, something that's going to get, and it grew. I mean, it had moisture, it grew. That's how I took care of it. That's the only time that's been that bad, and they made fun of me. Of course, for the following spring, or that fall, he had put alfalfa in there, and he had henbit out there wonderfully. And so, of course, I took the picture and asked what kind of cover crop that was with his alfalfa to kind of play back along. So crap happens. I mean, but if you're going to graze, if you got cover crops you want them to graze, I recommend grazing by the day with the customer instead of the field. And then if you got an experienced grazer, you know, he can kind of go with that with you. But if you think it's getting too wet or whatever, have it in the agreement. They need to leave as soon as possible, or have a pasture or someplace, you know, or if you got a tough hill that's crappy, put a few bales of hay out there and lock them into that spot while it's muddy until it dries back up. There's ways you can manage it and utilize those things, you know, so you can still have livestock out there even if you don't own them.
yeah. And if you watch the cow pies, I'm assuming that you're doing cattle. If you watch the cow pies, you first turn them on to a pat. Now, I'm talking like continuous grazing here, not rotational. But if you were to just turn cattle in here, they're going to start eating the very best of this stuff, and their cow pies are going to be, you know, great big, about this thin. As their diet gets more and more fibrous, it's going to get higher and higher and higher. And so when those start stacking up more than about an inch high, excuse me, they're not gaining anymore. They're not gaining anymore. Once those cow pies get 2 inches, I mean, they should have been gone and moved somewhere else. But we often fail to have a plan B.